Welcome to the Crawcast. I'm your host, George Crossack, and this is what happened in Week 9 of the NFL season. And if you like this type of content, make sure to hit that subscribe button like it owes you money. The first game is the Houston Texans versus the New York Jets. The Jets won 21-13. The Jets' leading passer is Aaron Rodgers, who threw for 211 yards and 3 touchdowns. Their leading rusher was Breece Hall, who had 74 rushing yards. And their leading receiver is Davante Adams, who had 91 receiving yards and a touchdown. And for the Texans, their leading passer is C.J. Stroud, who had 191 passing yards. Their leading rusher is Joe Mixon, who had 106 rushing yards and a touchdown. And then their leading receiver is Tank Dell, who had 126 passing yards. So in this game, I think both teams, well, the Texans struggled a lot, and the Jets actually looked pretty good, although they did struggle at times. And when I believe it was Corley, when he fumbled at the goal line, I was like, oh my God, this is how the Jets season ends. And it seemed like the most Jets moment ever is I'm like, they're going to lose by 7. And of course, they could have gotten that touchdown, but their player fumbled at the goal line. And I don't get how this happens. Like, it nearly happened to Kyle Pitts last week, and it just makes no sense to me. Just run the extra 3 feet into the end zone and then drop the ball. Like, I seriously don't get it. What's your big hurry to do a celebration where you can't get into the end zone before you drop the ball? It literally makes zero sense to me, and I don't understand how it keeps happening in the NFL. So CJ Stroud continues to struggle. His offensive line is bad and he's just not playing well at all. And I just have no explanation for it. I just think their team as a whole are struggling with injuries and they're just not that great of a team. And the Jets, they seem to be pulling their season back a little bit. They are a good team. They just keep losing in horrible circumstances. And honestly, like I said, if their kicker just made their field goals, they would be 6-2 before this game. So the Jets, they seem to be heading in the right direction. It's still going to be tough for them to dig their season out of this hole they created, but they still probably can do it. The next game is the Atlanta Falcons versus the Dallas Cowboys. The Falcons won 27-21. The Falcons' leading passer is Kirk Cousins, who had 222 passing yards and 3 touchdowns. Their leading rusher is Bijan Robinson, who had 86 rushing yards. And their leading receiver is Darnell Mooney, who had 88 receiving yards and a touchdown. And the Cowboys' leading passer is Dak Prescott, who had 133 yards and a touchdown. Their leading rusher is Rico Dowdle, who had 75 rushing yards. And their leading receiver is Jake Ferguson, who had 71 receiving yards. So the news out of this game is Dak Prescott's hurt. He's going to be missing a few weeks, and CeeDee Lamb is also hurt. Who know? We don't really know the extent of his injury yet, but it seems like the Cowboys' season is over. Rico Dowdle finally had a decent game, but their rushing attack overall throughout this year has just been non-existent, and Dak really hasn't been able to carry that load without a running game. And then for the Falcons, Kirk Cousins has just been on fire the past few weeks, and he has just really mastered the Falcons' offense, and the Falcons just really seem to be on a roll. And especially with their division as a whole struggling so much, I think the Falcons can be a scary contender. And I think this whole NFC is going to be pretty nerve-wracking because I believe there's only 5 out of the 16 teams that have a losing record at the moment. And so overall, the NFC is going to be very, very good for the season. So if you got to be extremely happy if you're the Falcons, and then the Cowboys more worrisome. I think Mike McCarthy is probably going to get fired at the end of the season. We'll see, but just overall, lots of panic and lots of disorganization with the Cowboys right now, and they just paid. And that's the problem with paying Dak and CD all this money, and now they're injured, and they can't make it up elsewhere. The next game is the Baltimore Ravens versus the Denver Broncos. The Ravens won 41-10. The Ravens' leading passer was Lamar Jackson, who had 280 yards and 3 touchdowns. Their leading rusher was Derrick Henry, who had 106 yards and 2 touchdowns. And their leading receiver was Zay Flowers, who had 127 yards and 2 touchdowns. And then for the Broncos, their leading passer was Bo Nix, who had 223 passing yards and an interception. Their leading rusher was Javonte Williams, who had 42 rushing yards, and their leading receiver was Courtland Sutton, who had 122 receiving yards. This was a bad game by the Broncos and a really great game by the Ravens. The Ravens were just really great all game. Lamar Jackson looked really good. Derrick Henry looked really great. And honestly, their offense has been unstoppable for this entire season. It's kind of like on paper what everyone thought it could be with Derrick Henry has turned out to kind of be true on what it has been. Zay Flowers also looked really great, and I think with the addition of Deontay Johnson, who didn't play in this game, it's going to start looking better. And then the Broncos, their defense has been great all season, and Bo Nix has just been average, and their defense really struggled during this game. And it's hard to really grade the Broncos in the sense that it's such a high-powered offense that it feels almost impossible to stop. Yet the Raiders, being terrible, they stopped it. So the Broncos, they just struggled a lot, but overall, again, just no real positives for the Broncos. Their defense just really let them down, and the Ravens offense and the whole Ravens team as a whole just keeps on humming. The next game is the Buffalo Bills versus the Miami Dolphins. The Bills won 30-27. The Bills' leading passer was Josh Allen, who had 235 yards, 3 touchdowns, and an interception. Their leading rusher was James Cook, who had 44 rushing yards, and their leading receiver was Ray Davis, who had 70 receiving yards and a touchdown. And then for the Dolphins, their leading passer is Tua, who had 231 yards and 2 touchdowns. Their leading rusher is Devon Achane, who had 63 rushing yards and a touchdown. Their leading receiver is Tyreek Hill, who had 80 receiving yards. So about this game, both teams actually looked pretty good. It feels like the Bills' defense struggles quite a bit, but their offense was really back at it. Although they did have kind of a lot of short kind of screen passes and short plays. And the Dolphins, I think you gotta be happy because your offense looks back to normal. Yes, they lost, but at least their offense is not terrible. I think their defense does need quite a bit of work, but again, the huge issue was Tim Boyle looked horrible, Tyler Huntley looked horrible, Skylar Thompson looked horrible, and the Dolphins' offense really couldn't run. Whereas now that they have Tua back, their offense looks like it is back to normal and it is running really well. And so I think if you're the Dolphins, you gotta be extremely happy of how this game went, even though you did end up losing. With the Dolphins looking back to yourselves. And then the Bills, they might have just locked up their division because the Jets are not doing that great. The Dolphins are horrible and the Patriots are terrible. So we'll see how that ends. But I think the Bills might have just won their division. The next game is the Carolina Panthers versus the New Orleans Saints. The Panthers won 23-22. The Panthers' leading passer was Bryce Young, who had 171 passing yards, 1 touchdown, and 1 interception. Their leading rusher was Chuba Hubbard, who had 72 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns. And their leading receiver was Jatavion Sanders, who had 87 receiving yards. And then for the Saints, their leading passer was Derek Carr, who had 236 passing yards and a touchdown. Their leading rusher was Alvin Kamara, who had 155 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was also Alvin Kamara, who had 60 receiving yards. So overall about this game, Bryce Young actually looked pretty decent. Again, I know he wasn't amazing, but for his standards, he looked really, really good. He looked like an actual, probably average NFL quarterback, and I think he is starting to save his career. I don't think the Panthers should trade him just because has had such a short career so far, and I just think it's too early to give up on him. And at least give him the remainder of the season and next year, because he was the first overall pick for a reason, and he did look pretty good. On the flip side of that, the Saints' defense is just so depleted and looks horrible that it could have been that's the reason why Bryce Young looked pretty decent. This game led to the firing of their head coach, Dennis Allen, who so far has not been a very good coach since Sean Payton left. And Derek Carr, he didn't look great. Alvin Kamara has just been great, and that's the real shock of the season, is Alvin Kamara has been amazing this entire year. And so after starting 2-0, the Saints have lost their last 7, and I think there's no hope for the Saints. And that with the Panthers, I think you gotta be happy because Bryce Young actually looks like he's improving and doing decent. And then the Saints just hope Derek Carr can fix something. I don't know because they did look good at Derek Carr until he got injured, and just hope Derek Carr turns it around. But there's a lot of panic with the Saints right now. The next game is the Cincinnati Bengals versus the Las Vegas Raiders. The Bengals won 41-24. The Bengals' leading passer was Joe Burrow, who had 251 passing yards, 5 touchdowns, and an interception. Their leading rusher was Chase Brown, who had 120 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Mike Gesicki, who had 100 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns. And for the Raiders, their leading passer was Gardner Minshew, who had 124 passing yards. Their leading rusher was Alexander Mattison, who had 36 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Jacoby Myers, who had 105 receiving yards. So more issues with the Raiders that they fired their offensive coordinator, they fired their quarterback's coach, and they fired somebody else I can't remember. But I think it might be time to fire Antonio Pierce. He's had his shot, and I understand he had the players backing, but so far he just hasn't been a good coach, and I think he just needs to get fired at this moment. And then with the Bengals, Joe Burrow threw 5 touchdowns, and the Bengals offense looks really great. And I definitely think they're in the playoff picture of kind of how bad the AFC is looking. And overall, if you're the Bengals, you just got to be extremely happy with the way you're turning around this team, especially after a horrible, horrible start. The next game is the Los Angeles Chargers versus the Cleveland Browns. The Chargers won 27-10. The Chargers' leading passer was Justin Herbert, who had 282 yards and 2 touchdowns. Their leading rusher was J.K. Dobbins, who had 85 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns. And their leading receiver was Quentin Johnston, who had 118 receiving yards and a touchdown. And for the Browns, their leading passer is Jameis Winston, who had 235 yards, 1 touchdown, 3 interceptions. Their leading rusher is Nick Chubb, who had 39 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Cedric Tillman, who had 75 receiving yards and a touchdown. So about this game, it feels like more of the struggles about the Browns' offense. And the Chargers, their offense looked great, and their defense looked pretty decent. But Jameis Winston, he's kind of showing why he wasn't really a starting quarterback. He's definitely doing better than Deshaun Watson, but with his 3 interceptions and just he kind of struggled a lot today. And they had no run game. Nick Chubb, I hate to say it, but I think his career might be over. He has not looked like himself the past couple of games, and he completely tore his knee and leg up, and I just think his career might be done, and he just has not been looking good at all whatsoever. So the Chargers, you got to be extremely, extremely happy with the win. And then the Browns, their struggles will just continue, but at least they'll get a better draft pick. That's the one positive out of this for them. The next game is the Washington Commanders versus the New York Giants. The Commanders won 27-22. The Commanders' leading passer is Jaden Daniels, who had 209 yards and 2 touchdowns. Their leading rusher was Chris Rodriguez Jr., who had 52 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Noah Brown, who had 60 receiving yards. And then for the Giants, their leading passer is Daniel Jones, who had 174 passing yards and 2 touchdowns. Their leading rusher is Tyrone Tracy Jr., who had 66 rushing yards. And their leading receiver is Malik Nabers, who had 59 receiving yards. Overall, both teams actually looked pretty good in this game. Jaden Daniels looked really good, and Daniel Jones didn't look that bad. At one point, it was funny because he had 4 completions for 0 yards and a touchdown, which feels very weird for a Daniel Jones stat. But Tyrone Tracy's looked great. Malik Nabers looked really good, and their defense has been pretty good overall this season. So Daniel Jones didn't look terrible in this game, but the Commanders are just a better team, plain and simple. And Jaden Daniels looked really good, and he's definitely going to win Offensive Rookie of the Year. So it'll be interesting to see how far they can go in the playoffs. The Giants, it's one of those things where it feels like they're good enough in the sense that they shouldn't fire their general manager and coach, but they're just not that good. So it's really hard to measure the Giants. Honestly, I'd probably keep it as is and not change anything over next season. I'd definitely try to get a better quarterback than Daniel Jones, but their team isn't that bad. They just are struggling with Daniel Jones, plain and simple. The next game is the New England Patriots versus the Tennessee Titans. The Titans won 20-17. The Titans' leading passer was Mason Rudolph, who had 240 yards, 2 touchdowns, and an interception. Their leading rusher was Tony Pollard, who had 128 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Calvin Ridley, who had 73 receiving yards. And then for the Patriots, their leading passer is Drake May, who had 206 passing yards, 1 touchdown, 2 interceptions. Their leading rusher was Drake May, who had 95 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Hunter Henry, who had 56 receiving yards. So overall, the Titans actually looked pretty good. Mason Rudolph looked decent. He had that one bad interception, but Tony Pollard has also been a big shock of the season. He's looked really, really great for the Titans, and the Titans' defense honestly isn't that bad. With the Patriots, you gotta be happy because Drake May is at least showing potential, and that's kind of what you want from a rookie quarterback. Not all rookie quarterbacks really play good. Honestly, I think it's more of a rarity that rookie quarterbacks play well. And so Drake May even showing potential is great news for the Patriots. And overall, I think you're going to be happy if you're the Patriots because Drake May's showing potential like he can be an NFL quarterback. And then the Titans, you got to be happy with a win, even though their season is kind of over, and I just don't see them pulling it back. The next game is the Philadelphia Eagles versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. The Eagles won 28-23. The Eagles' leading passer is Jalen Hurts, who had 230 yards and 2 touchdowns. Their leading rusher was Saquon Barkley, who had 159 rushing yards and a touchdown. Their leading receiver was Devonta Smith, who had 87 receiving yards and a touchdown. And for the Jaguars, they had Trevor Lawrence was their leading passer at 169 yards and 2 touchdowns. Their leading rusher was Tanks Bigsby, who had 24. Travis Etienne was their leading rusher, who had 24 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Evan Ingram, who had 45 receiving yards. So this game, the Jaguars looked bad. Plain and simple, they just didn't look good. Their offense struggled a lot, and the Eagles, they looked pretty good. Even though they nearly blew it at the end, their team overall looked really good. Saquon Barkley had that insane, backwards hurdle, and Devonta Smith has been playing really well. And just overall, the Eagles have just been playing great. Even though they've been kind of blowing it in close games and situationally bad, overall, they've been really good this season. And the Jaguars continue to struggle, and I'm curious what they're going to do, if they're going to potentially fire their coach or what's going to happen. Um, the next game is the Chicago Bears versus the Arizona Cardinals. The Cardinals won 29-9. The Cardinals' leading passer was Kyler Murray, who had 154 passing yards. Their leading rusher was James Conner, who had 107 rushing yards. Their leading receiver was Trey McBride, who had 35 receiving yards. And for the Bears, their leading passer was Caleb Williams, who had 217 passing yards. Their leading rusher was DeAndre Swift, who had 54 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Rome Odunze, who had 104 receiving yards. So in this game, Kyler Murray did not look good. He didn't, but the Cardinals' defense looked really, really great. And Jonathan Gannon needs a lot of credit for that. And honestly, it's kind of very shocking of how good that they're doing. Because even though Kyler Murray is struggling, and he has been a little bit streaky and very on and off, it's just that their defense has improved majorly, and they don't really have any stars on their defense. And that's kind of the key thing where I just think they have really great coaches, and they've been playing really well on um in this game. And that you have to give major, major props to uh the Cardinals for that. And then the Bears, Caleb Williams kind of struggled a lot, and that's kind of that, more or less. Just the next game is the Detroit Lions versus the Green Bay Packers. The Lions won 24-14, and the Lions' leading passer was Jared Goff, who had 145 passing yards and a touchdown. Their leading rusher was David Montgomery, who had 73 rushing yards, and their leading receiver was Amon-Ra St. Brown, who had 56 receiving yards and a touchdown. And for the Packers, their leading passer is Jordan Love, who had 273 passing yards and an interception. Their leading rusher is Josh Jacobs, who had 95 rushing yards. Their leading receiver is Jayden Reed, who had 113 receiving yards. So honestly, in this game, I think you're pretty happy if you're the Packers. Obviously, not happy if a loss, but it felt like the Lions really didn't beat the Packers. The Packers kind of beat the Packers in the sense that the Lions really didn't play that well. Jared Goff really didn't do much. He had that one great play to Amon-Ra St. Brown, and other than that, the Lions really didn't do much. The key of the game was the pick six from Jordan Love. It was a terrible play, terrible throw. He should have never done it, and that's kind of what won the Lions the game. And then the Packers, they just had a lot of drops and a lot of penalties. And honestly, that stuff is why I say it's positive for the Packers, because that stuff you should be able to clean up and fix almost instantly. And so if the Packers can do that, they should be really great, and they should have won this game, honestly. And then one thing that's kind of shocking to me is when I saw a lot of people talking about the Brian Branch getting ejected. Honestly, I'm surprised that was controversial because it was him leading with his helmet and the helmet-to-helmet hit. We've seen Derwin James get suspended for a game because of that. That is clearly the NFL standard now, that if you are leading with your helmet, you are going to get ejected. And that's the standard now. You might like it, you might not like it, but that is what they do now. Vontez Burfict even got banned from playing the game because of it. So, overall, just obviously, if you're the Lions, you're happy with a win. I think you do need to trade for an edge rusher because you didn't really get much pressure on Love. And then the Packers, you just have to clean up the simple mistakes. Like they're not like feels like them the Packers, they're kind of hurting themselves more than the other teams are beating them. And because I think they're like second in penalties and fourth in drops and just sloppy play the Packers need to clean up. The next game is the Rams versus the Seahawks, and the Rams won 26-20. The Rams' leading passer was Matthew Stafford, who threw for 298 yards, 2 touchdowns, and an interception. Their leading rusher was Kyren Williams, who had 69 rushing yards, and their leading receiver was Cooper Kupp, who had 104 receiving yards. And then the Seahawks, their leading passer is Geno Smith, who had 363 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, and 3 interceptions. Their leading rusher was Kenneth Walker, who had 83 rushing yards, and their leading receiver was Jackson Smith-Njigba, who had 180 yards and 2 touchdowns. So in this game, Matthew Stafford looked great. He played really well. Cooper Kupp played really well. Demarcus Robinson played really well. Just overall, the Rams played really well as a whole. And then Geno Smith, he threw a couple of bad interceptions, but overall, he played pretty well too. And Jackson Smith-Njigba is now starting to emerge as a wide receiver 1. He had a tremendous game, and both teams looked really good. And I think you're happy if you're both teams. Obviously, you're not happy with the loss if you're Seattle, but both teams looked really good in this game, and it was an exciting game. The next game is the Minnesota Vikings versus the Indianapolis Colts. The Vikings won 21-13. The Vikings' leading passer was Sam Darnold, who had 290 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions. Their leading rusher was Aaron Jones, who had 64 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Justin Jefferson, who had 137 yards. And then for the Colts, their leading passer was Joe Flacco, who had 179 yards and an interception. Their leading rusher was Jonathan Taylor, who had 48 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was Josh Downs, who had 60 receiving yards. Overall in this game, neither team looked that great. The Vikings offense struggled a lot, and Sam Darnold did struggle quite a bit. And then Joe Flacco struggled a lot in this game, quite frankly. He did not really play well, and I still think it was the correct decision to bench Anthony Richardson for Joe Flacco, because they're at the point where they want to at least try to make the playoffs. The division is still in hand because the Texans are struggling, and I do think Joe Flacco is the guy that will help you win more games than Anthony Richardson at this point. And then the Vikings, I think you just got to be happy with a win. Your defense did look really good and performed back to normal after the bad games against the Lions and the Rams. And their offense struggled quite a bit, and they kind of overcame that with their great defense. So it'll be very interesting how both these teams go on from the season. And the final game of the week is the Kansas City Chiefs versus the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. The Chiefs won 30-24. The Chiefs' leading passer was Patrick Mahomes, who had 291 yards and 3 touchdowns. Their leading rusher was Kareem Hunt, who had 106 rushing yards and a touchdown. And their leading receiver was Travis Kelce, who had 100 receiving yards. And for the Buccaneers, their leading passer was Baker Mayfield, who had 200 passing yards and 2 touchdowns. Their leading rusher was Bucky Irving, who had 24 rushing yards. And their leading receiver was K. Dotton, who had 77 receiving yards and a touchdown. So this was a pretty interesting game. Both teams looked pretty decent. This is really the first game Mahomes has looked pretty good this year. And he's mostly just been relying on the defense saving him because he really hasn't played well this year. And then the Buccaneers, they really stayed in it, and Baker Mayfield played well, even though all his receivers are injured, and it seems like they're not doing too great. And so the big play at the end was the Buccaneers scored a touchdown, and they decided to go to overtime instead of going for 2. I was really shocked that they did this, because their defense was kind of struggling against the Chiefs, and that's what surprised me, because it's like, okay, you basically have a 50-50 shot to gain effectively 2 yards, or you can try to stop the Chiefs from scoring a touchdown and then have you guys drive down and score a touchdown or a field goal. And I just felt like the odds of that working would be better and going for the 2-point conversion. And so it really shocked me that they didn't, but overall that's just it's kind of win if it's like it's a good or bad decision either way you look at it, in the sense that if they went for two and didn't get it, oh, of course they shouldn't have gone for two. And then if they went for two and got it, of course it's the right decision. So overall, this is a pretty decent slate of games. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you like this type of content, make sure to hit that subscribe button like it owes you money. I'll see you on the next one.